I'd like to welcome everybody again to the first in a amazing series of webinars on consumer rights and economic advocacy for survivors that we'll be hosting over the course of the next 2 years. Today, I'm thrilled to invite CSAJ's expert advisor, Katie Von der Linde, and CSAJ's founder and executive director, Erica Sussman, in this first an overview webinar, a guide to consumer and economic civil legal advocacy for survivors. Please keep introducing yourselves, and I will hand it off to Erica to do a little bit more introduction.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks so much, Katie, for joining me today. And thanks to everybody who is participating in today's webinar. It is always humbling and energizing to be joined by a group with such diverse and rich expertise in so many different areas of advocacy and law. And it's just really exciting to be with you all today, and I'm looking forward to learning from you all as you contribute to the conversation that we'll be having over the course of the next hour and a half. As Sarah said, my name is Erica Sussman, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. And I'm thrilled to be with you all today to launch a series of webinars that is focused on the guidebook for consumer and economic civil legal advocacy for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Today is the first in that series, and we will be talking generally about the guidebook, as well as talking with you all about different pieces of advocacy practice from a framework perspective. So thrilled to be with you all. In terms of CSAJ, I do want to just give you a very general introduction for those who are new to our organization. So CSAJ has a very ambitious vision. Our vision is for a world where all people have equal access to physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. And our mission is, in an effort to achieve that vision, CSAJ promotes advocacy approaches that remove systemic barriers, enhance organizational responses, and improve professional practices to meet the self-defined needs of domestic and sexual violence survivors. So with that as background, I also just want to add that this particular webinar is part of our Consumer Rights for Domestic and Sexual Violence Survivors project, which is a technical assistance project that's funded through the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice. And the purpose of the project is to build the capacity of and to build partnerships between domestic violence and consumer and anti-poverty lawyers and advocates across the country. With that as background, I'm going to turn now to the next slide. Let's see if I can get myself there. Oh, I went too far. And hand it over to Katie.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much, Erica. It's such a great pleasure to be able to be here with you today, and especially to be with the wonderful Erica Sussman, and I really appreciate it. So today we have actually a pretty ambitious agenda for our webinar time. We really want to share with you in this time our new tool, the Guidebook. And we're really going to try to walk you through and see how it is such a special and amazing document that will hopefully really be a useful tool for you all. So we're going to be doing that. We're also going to be looking at the foundations of the link between economic insecurity and violence that survivors are dealing with. In addition to that, we're going to look at the landscape of multi-level survivor-centered economic advocacy. So the lens that we're coming from today is really looking at how survivors' needs, wants, hopes, contextualized lives can really help us to guide our advocacy efforts on not only the individual level, but as well as the organizational level and the policy level as well. And then we were also going to be looking at the structure of our upcoming trainings and webinar series. that's our goals for today. And, oh, I also went too far. So what are we, oops, and again, sorry everybody. So what are we actually talking about today? We're really looking at this advocacy efforts that are consumer driven, that are looking at advocacy for survivors, that gives survivors critical information, tools, and options that are really addressing the profound and long-term economic harms that come from experiencing intimate partner violence, but also that come from experiencing poverty. We're going to be taking a look at that in a more deep way soon. But you will see that this legal and non-legal advocacy covers a whole gamut of aspects. So if we're looking at that, if we look at this from survivors' issues, we can look at this beautiful slide that shows all of these different needs. So we can look at Zoe in the top left corner, who is unable to open a bank account because of her home location. So we can see that every survivor that we're working with have very complex needs around their economic issues, concerns that are really connected to not only the abuse that they're experiencing by their abusive partner, who may be using a wide variety of tactics around economic abuse, but also through their own identities. So potentially from issues of racism or issues of what the religious concerns that they have that may be impacting their economic concerns. So I talked about Zoe. We also have Jenna, who has court-related barriers, that's trying to wait for an order of protection, but now she has to leave the court in order to pick up her kids at the end of the school day. And as a result, she has to decide, am I going to come back tomorrow for court and risk losing employment? So we can see that there are all of these many very complex issues related to economic needs that survivors have that really have a wide gamut of concerns. And the why that we think that this is really important is because we feel like the domestic violence movement has talked a little about doing economic justice work, but many of the efforts have been made on kind of a little bit of information or knowledge, but less has been really done on looking at how individual advocacy is really informed by the variety of needs that survivors have as a result of their different identities, but also how organizationally and with our partnerships, how we are able to respond to survivors' economic needs, and also how we are responding as a movement to the policy needs and the systems needs that are really impacting survivor safety by decreasing their economic security and decreasing their choices that they have based on that. So we feel that doing advocacy work on these consumer issues is key to doing this.
Katie, I'm wondering if we might want to ask folks, because some of the examples were laid out in that slide that you were just jumping into, and if participants also want to offer up some examples now and even as we continue about how economic issues and barriers are showing up for you in your work with survivors on a daily basis. If you want to offer up some examples, some common examples of ways in which economic barriers emerge in your work, we would love to hear about them.
Thank you, Erica.
Sure.
Let's see them coming up. So we'll continue to look at them. We see that Krista DeGallo is talking about debt or credit issues that are coming on, and we see some issues around banking passwords hidden or changed, so access to different economic services that folks are having challenges with as well. Mm-hmm. So we'll continue to look at those as we look at the tool that we're going to be talking about that we've been working on, which is the Guidebook. So if we look at the tool that we want to talk about today with y'all, it is a document that we've been working on that looks at consumer and economic civil legal advocacy on a wide variety of topics. You can see the list of chapters that are included in the advocacy manual. And if you look back to those survivors that we were just looking at briefly, for example, Zoe, we were talking about that she was having challenges because she didn't have a bank location in her area, and that she was looking at needing to use payday lending. So we could look at, if we're looking at what's happening with Zoe, we could look at these issues within the guidebook and look at chapter 4 that may have some information. Chapter 3 about credit discrimination, predatory lending, gives some information about that. As I was talking about earlier, Jenna, who was struggling with court-related barriers, was looking for an order of protection. She could look at chapter 12. We could look at that as her advocate to try to figure out what are some barriers and what are things that are going on. I see Catherine Hampton was talking about housing barriers and debt, and issues related to debt and housing. We could see that within the advocacy booklet, that there is information about housing and also about credit and how credit issues have really brought up issues of this. And what's really cool about the guidebook is that it really is a tool that has very clear practice tips in addition to the information. So if we were looking at kind of the challenges for survivors around credit and ordering credit reports, we can see in this example here that the guidebook itself includes information about the safety that when ordering credit reports and some issues that come up for survivors. But included along the guidebook, along the way, are practice tips that give you very specific information about what could be, if this is a larger issue for you or your client, what are some actual things that you could use. So for example, on here, it talks about if there are challenges that the survivor cannot safely get a credit report, talking about what are some potential options and some variety of ways to deal with that. This tool really does give direct hands-on practice ideas that really comes from the survivors' needs and wants and different challenges that they're coming from, and gives us tips that actually come from practitioners who have been engaging in economic justice work for a long time. The other thing that the guidebook does is really helps us identify issue spotting or assessment kind of questions related to the specific topic that is covered within that guidebook chapter. So again, we're looking here at an example that comes out of the credit chapter. And you see this list of questions that for credit screening, for example, what are your biggest concerns about credits? Tell me about concerns that you have about looking at a credit report. These are key issues and questions that survivors will be helped to think about as we're doing assessments or trying to figure out, as an advocate, where do we need to start? Where does the survivor really feel like this is the biggest concern for them? How can I ask questions about this to guide our work together? And each chapter has very specific assessment questions, issue spotting questions to help advocates really pull out what is going on for survivors and to find that so that that can direct the advocacy. In addition, the guidebook has things called think about it sections that really help advocates and lawyers as they're reading the guidebook to think about how different identities of survivors may impact the advocacy or the questions that you're wanting to ask for the survivor. So this think about it section kind of talks about that if this survivor that you're working with has different identities, how that may impact the advocacy that they receive, but also how that may impact the resources that are available for them or some of the issues that may come up as they're trying to access resources. The other tool that is throughout the guidebook is that each chapter is really framed using a survivor story, so that while the information is specific about the topics, for example, tax law, we will have an opening story that is woven throughout the book to the chapter to identify kind of what are the specific needs and help you really contextualize the information in the guidebook to an actual survivor story. The stories are very diverse and really try to bring the focus of the guidebook out so that the reader is engaged and also can see how these different issues are related to different survivors and what's going on for them throughout that. Sorry. So and now I'm going to hand it over for Erica. She kind of gives us information about CSA's framework for how do we do this work.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And thanks everybody for all of your input along the way. I just want to acknowledge some of those pieces, and you'll see how much of what you've been saying is going to be lifted up in the conversation that we're having today. So Carla Sanchez Adams was just talking about how she sees all of these issues, and I think it is the intersection of so many of these issues that makes this work so complex, and that makes the economic hardship so profound and in need of very powerful tools like those that are offered in the guidebook. And so we'll be talking in greater depth about that. Similarly, Jason from California is talking about sort of the disconnect between law, laws that are available, and how those play out in practice, and sort of how the survivors not knowing about particular protections may often create barriers that then compound their economic security further down the line. So thank you for those contributions, and I think it's actually a very nice lead into what I'm about to start talking about, which is the framework of CSAJ's work. As Katie just mentioned, this guidebook is not a black letter law guide. It's not simply a resource that offers discrete areas of legal remedies, but rather it is more of a resource that thinks very carefully about how these economic issues play out in the context of survivors' intersectional identities and the barriers that they face in real life, and thinks critically about how to make connections between survivors' lived realities and the way that we carry out our advocacy. So, and we're going to talk more about that framework right now, because I do think that it's critical to engaging in the survivor-centered approach to this work, which is really sort of the umbrella of the entire guidebook. So we begin thinking about how to engage in this work through what's presented in this graphic, that there is a reciprocal relationship between abuse and economic hardship. The link between poverty and domestic violence is well substantiated by researchers and service providers and advocates and survivors of intimate partner violence themselves. Women who are living in poverty experience domestic violence at twice the rate of those who do not. In other words, that means that there are 2 times as many women living in poverty experiencing domestic violence as women who are not living in poverty. And you can see some of the data here in this slide that women who are receiving public benefits, 70% of them report having experienced domestic violence. Homeless women report having experienced domestic violence at a rate of 50%. And that's in comparison to 25% of women overall. And this really speaks to a particular type of abuse. All forms of abuse can lead to economic harms, right? They could be medical damages or damages to one's property, or all sorts of harms leading directly, economic harms that are coming directly from the abuse. But it's, hasn't been until recently that the field has begun to really explore the impact of abuse that is economic in nature. And that's really what this slide is talking about. So in 2008, researchers, Adrienne Adams and some of her colleagues developed what is called a scale of economic abuse. They conducted face-to-face interviews with about 103 women across the state of Michigan who were receiving services And they defined economic abuse in this way. Economic abuse involves behaviors that control a woman's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, thus threatening her economic security and potential for self-sufficiency. And what they found through their series of interviews is that 99% of those respondents, 99% of respondents reported that they had been subjected to some form of economic abuse during the course of their relationship. That percentage is even higher than those who had been impacted by physical abuse. So in other words, the economic coercion was even greater than the physical coercion that domestic violence survivors experienced. And I'm sure that all of us can talk about, and actually I invite you to share with us some examples of economic abuse that you witness in your own practice. The researchers in this study grouped them into two different categories. One is economic control, so limiting access or preventing use of economic resources. And then the other form is identified as economic exploitation, which is sabotaging and intentionally depleting resources in order to limit a survivor's access to safety options. So again, if you feel wanting, please share with us in the chat box some examples of economic abuse that your clients experience, and we will be sure to weave those into our conversation as we move forward. This slide talks about the economic impact of domestic violence. So we know that domestic violence is linked with to a range of negative economic outcomes, which can include, and these are just a handful, but are certainly very prominent: income and job loss, housing instability, limited transportation, decreased access to childcare. And of course, what all of these economic impacts have in common is that they lead to a decreased safety options, which in turn leads to an increased risk of future violence, right? So it's not the poverty that is causing the domestic violence, rather it is poverty that is decreasing survivors' tools to be able to protect themselves from violence in the future. And all of these, that are outlined in this slide right here are certainly common economic impacts that lead to both of these outcomes. Okay. This next slide talks about some work that CSAJ has done in the past, and I think we see increasingly more as we delve into this work with all of you. And that is the economic ripple effect. So it's based on some fieldwork that was conducted by CSAJ's previous director of research, Sarah Schoner. And she had conducted interviews with survivors all over the country in 4 different locations, and came to recognize a pattern, right? So, and that pattern really is what's referred to here as the economic ripple effect. So that while it's often common for us to identify discrete economic harms that survivors experience, whether it's a damage to somebody's vehicle or a particular incident of harm to one's credit, really what we see is that the economic impacts of abuse ripple across the lifespan. And so that's really what's depicted here in this graphic. You'll see that during the course of one's relationship, some of the harms may involve job loss or credit damage or debt, missed work days. Then on leaving an abusive relationship, there may be relocation costs or incurred debt during the course of one's marriage or legal fees. expended in trying to extricate themselves. In the short term, it may lead to foregone wages and housing instability, huge childcare costs, increased cost of independent living. And then over the lifetime, we see really substantial economic impacts that might involve the costs of mental health, certainly obstructed and slowed professional and educational development, and again, all of which are leading to increased vulnerability to future abuse. So this economic ripple effect is something that we really see as a motivating factor to engage in consumer advocacy, because it enables us to target these long-term compounded aspects of economic harm. So some of the economic impacts that this one I think is of particular relevance to those who are engaged in lawyering or other forms of legal advocacy. It's not just that violence leads to economic hardship, but rather that survivors' efforts to access safety often have an economic price tag. So here that's depicted in the context of a protection order hearing, where research done by Hughes and Brush showed that in the year after petitioning for a civil protection order, a survivor incurred anywhere from $300 to approximately $1,000, and that economic cost was not recouped over the course of time. So simply trying to access protection has huge costs as well. Oops. This highlights some of the systemic failings, and I'm not going to go into deep detail here because we have a lot more to cover, but some of the short-term failings involve housing instability. 80% of survivors exiting shelter have no place to go. An inadequate legal system, even those who access child support find that it's inadequate in terms of addressing their needs. And this goes really back to detailing a bit more the economic ripple effect, that that economic harms related to domestic and sexual violence create a pathway of economic disadvantage that manifest in the form of consumer impacts, right? So 81% reporting trouble with a credit rating. They manifest in terms of opportunity costs, so that survivors are facing employment instability lasting for months at a time, constrained career growth, which then impacts their long-term work trajectory, as well as the health and quality of life costs over the course of one's life, increasing health costs that could last up to 15 years after abuse. I want to talk here about some compounding factors that involve structural inequality and the economic impacts of structural inequality, because I think that oftentimes when we talk about economic justice work in our movement, we're not paying quite as much attention to the structural factors that lead to particular barriers for marginalized communities, and we really can't do economic justice making unless we do acknowledge and address those systemic barriers. This slide talks about the fact that domestic violence, that the greatest predictor of intimate partner violence is income and employment, and that is across race. But this slide talks about how there are unique structural barriers facing survivors. So that may take place in the form of resource availability, service response, and impact of policies. And you can see some of them here. So in terms of resource availability, I'm sure that we can all put our finger on many of those. But just to give you some examples, and I want to mention here that our atlas does a very nice job of this if you're interested in digging that up. So resource availability. So in many instances, survivors can't access services or resources just due to the way that they operate. So whether we're talking about transportation or travel costs or the hours of operation, Accessibility and other procedures literally determine a survivor's ability to access those systems. And as a result, advocacy and shelters and courts and other services often prove to be inaccessible to survivors, particularly those who are constrained by economic hardship. In terms of service response, survivors' experiences with institutional actors and their experiences with the rules and the processes of programs and services matter a great deal in their options for safety and economic security. So some of the examples here might be perceptions and biases of court actors who literally control access to justice. In courts, there are sometimes preferences for two-parent families, even when there are clear risks posed to survivors and their children. It may take the form of punitive outcomes by judges who are uninformed about the nature of domestic violence. It could also take the form of public benefits workers who are overburdened and sometimes hostile to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And then lastly, the effect of unequal policies. So I'll just give you one quick example here, which I think was alluded to by somebody earlier, and that would be credit reporting and credit checks that act as barriers to employment. So the policy of checking individuals' credit often compounds survivors' economic insecurity. Oftentimes folks have very damaged credit as a result of the abuse that they've experienced. And by using that as a way to determine one's access to employment or access to housing, it pushes survivors deeper into poverty and leaves them with fewer options. And then I'm just going to address this slide before we move on to a very concrete opportunity for us to delve into doing some of this work and drawing from some of these larger insights. So this slide talks about social inequality and its connection to survivors' access to safety. And you'll see from that there's a lot of data here, but in essence, there are 2 points that I just want to leave you with. One is that the connection between social inequality and violence, right? So while 1 in 3 white women report having experienced domestic violence, the rates of abuse increase dramatically it could be 50% and higher for those who are marginalized by race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, citizenship status, and ability. So we know that there's a disproportionate impact of violence on marginalized communities on the one hand. And then at the same time, there's a connection between social inequality and poverty, so that while 1 in 10 white people live at or below the poverty line, that number rises to 1 in 4 or higher for all other racial and ethnic groups. So when you take these 2 things together, the connection between social inequality and violence and the connection between social inequality and poverty, what we find is that survivors who are socially and politically marginalized, they experience unique barriers to safety and economic security, which vary across and also within groups. And these barriers perpetuate poverty and increase the risk of future violence. There is a lot more to say there, but perhaps we'll delve into that as we delve into the concrete example that we have to engage with this afternoon. Great, so now with that, we wanted to pose a question to you all, which is what economic or consumer issues are showing up for the survivors that you work with? And I guess I would also add to that sort of what are you doing to address those issues? What are the types of strategies that you are currently engaged in? So what are the issues and what are the types of strategies that you are using in your day-to-day advocacy practice?
And Erica, while you were talking, we had some engagement on the chat, which included answering some of this question would be answering about people having not having access to bank accounts, having abusive partners who are not allowing folks to get jobs, And then challenges around some policies, including things like survivors needing to present driver's license or IDs in order to have that they have to present their driver's license or ID, or they don't get the funds to get the ID, and kind of the challenge that includes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right, and so access to some of those things that you just mentioned, Katie, around access to being able to even get a driver's license. Some folks here have talked about the particular impact of immigration policies, as well as laws related to LGBT rights pose enormous barriers to economic stability and therefore safety for survivors. Yeah, absolutely.
Also seen some engagement. Carla talked about issues around credit reporting and using the Fair Credit Reporting Act and declaratory judgment suits as a strategy, it looks like, as well, within some sounds like some consumer rights advocacy work. Also use of the innocent spouse relief, which is also really included in our tax chapter for some more information for folks in the guidebook as well.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like also there's some work to create a manual for domestic violence advocates and survivors to address fees and fines and suspensions that come from traffic fines and driver's license suspensions, which we are seeing nationwide as a huge challenge for a lot of our survivors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the very first client that I ever had actually had faced just that problem, and the fines were not from herself, they were from her partner who had used her car and just ran up a huge amount of fees in parking violations and traffic violations. Yeah, and so what does that create for survivors in terms of barriers to transportation and then ability to work? Yeah, great.
Looks like Sarah talked about they're having challenges with ICE coming in, detaining immigrants, trying to get protection from abuse orders. Some issues, a lot of issues there. Some work, also Carla mentioned this, doing financial literacy work and empowerment work, tort suit issues.
Okay, so this really just circles us back to where we started, this next slide. So why consumer rights? I think you all are sort of highlighting that for us because of the powerful tools that it has to offer to address some of these really profound challenges that are not just a matter of financial literacy or individual skill building, but that really can target the profound and often compounded economic impacts of abuse and poverty more generally. Okay, I'm going to quickly talk about this and then hand it back to Katie. So this is back in 2013, we became very interested in learning more about what was going on in the field and exploring some of what we saw then as gaps. And so we created a consumer rights national needs assessment in which we got responses back from about 220 lawyers and advocates all over the country, both folks who identified as consumer and also domestic violence advocates. And what we learned is that domestic violence advocates at that point in time often were not addressing the ways in which coercion manifested as economic abuse. So while we might be very skilled in talking about coercive control in the context of physical violence, the skills were not quite as sharp in the context of economic abuse. We found that folks were often not screening for economic issues that required more technical expertise, so things along the lines of bankruptcy and tax. And we also learned, and this is a critical one, because it speaks to some of the structural barriers we were talking about before. We learned that folks were really not developing institutionalized policies, protocols, and practices to encourage the type of collaboration that needed to be happening between the domestic violence and the anti-poverty community movements, et cetera. And it was really this third one that led us to engage with organizations, with communities, in some instances with statewide coalitions, one of whom is on this conference call, the Texas Coalition, Texas Council on Family Violence, to really do a deep dive into thinking about how to examine and strengthen the institutional and systemic responses to the economic needs of survivors. So let's see. And this leads us to the next slide on our multi-level approach to economic advocacy for survivors. Should I do this one, Katie?
Yep, unless if you want, I can do it.
Nope, I'm good.
You're good.
So this really tracks, this may sound familiar to you because earlier in the program we were talking about CSAJ's mission, and it really is reflected in this graphic and in the approach that we're advocating in the guidebook as well as in much of our work. And that is, in order to do this work powerfully and transformatively, it needs to be engaged in from multiple levels of advocacy. So that means enhancing individual advocacy that addresses both the physical safety as well as the economic safety needs of the survivor. So we know that there is no safety for survivors without access to economic justice. And we also know that economic strategies that don't pay attention to the safety and privacy needs of survivors are not going to meet their needs. So it's really a philosophy of holding both of those things simultaneously when engaging in individual advocacy. The second level of impact is through organizational and community reform. So that requires really strong and meaningful partnership building between domestic violence, anti-poverty, anti-racist fields that attend to the ways in which physical and economic and other risks face survivors and fundamentally shape their opportunities for securing safety. And I think many of you have alluded to how the risks that survivors face are complex, and in order to do this work well, it really does require partnership across movement and across institutions. And then the third level of change is through systems advocacy. So it requires that we engage in local to statewide to federal efforts to remove institutional barriers, identify and implement laws and policies, and conduct impact litigation and other forms of systems change that are attuned to the systemic inequalities that survivors, particularly those who are marginalized, are facing. So it's through this multi-level approach that economic justice strategies are most likely to be meaningful. I think there are just a couple of questions depending on where you sit. So one of them is, what would my current work, and this is going to vary for each person. So what would my current work look like if I were to approach it from an economic lens, if I were to really center the economic needs of survivors? So if I'm somebody who does mostly family law cases, that means, thinking about including economic relief in the context of civil protection order cases. It might mean focusing on the economic needs of survivors in matrimonial cases. And then the other question is, how can we address the profound economic needs of survivors that are sort of outside the bounds of the work that we're engaged in right now? And that may be expanding your toolbox. It may be developing relationships with folks who hold other expertise It often does not mean simply referring out, because we know that oftentimes survivors get lost in the cracks when we simply are doing a referral out, but rather more of a cross-training and a partnership building process that's going to ensure that survivors' needs are comprehensively met. So screening for consumer and economic legal issues, collaborating with consumer and other anti-poverty lawyers, and then just more generally expanding our toolbox to include consumer and other forms of economic, civil, legal advocacy. With all of that, I'm going to hand things back to Katie, who's going to talk very concretely about how to translate this model of multi-level survivor-centered economic advocacy into practice.
Thanks, Erica. So Erica did a really wonderful job helping us look at the very complicated picture that makes economic work really challenging, and I think really engages us to see that, yes, we need to be doing economic work. But one of the questions that we have is, how do we do this economic work? And so the framework of CSAJ is really that we're coming to this work from a survivor-centered way. So if you look at some of the seminal thoughts about advocacy, Herbert and Mould wrote in a long time ago that advocacy is not primarily concerned with providing a service, but rather assuring the availability and relevance of the service that's provided. So to me, this speaks so well to survivor-centered work, that it's not just saying to survivors, here are what we do and here's what we have to offer, but looking at what does the survivor need and how does their complex story really situate what their concerns are, what's the biggest priority for them, and how do we then center the advocacy we do based on those needs that survivor has, and also the strengths that they have that they bring with them. So really, survivor-centered work is the idea that our best outcomes come from when we work with survivors in partnership. And that recognizing that the survivor is expert of their own situation, they can understand the risks that they're experiencing and balance those risks that include not only the risks that they're dealing with from what their partner is doing in their life, but also the risks that they have from the context of their life that they're living. And also that the survivor really knows what they've tried before and can build upon that work. So we're not doing safety planning kind of starting from scratch, but we're understanding what the survivor has engaged with before, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what they would like to try again as they're looking for their strategies. So really understanding that we are working on trying to increase folks' self-determination in order to increase their safety, and that we can't work with folks around their safety issues until we also really listen to what their needs are and what their concerns are. We also have some pretty good evidence that actually this is a very effective strategy to use within advocacy. So we see some work by Nicole Allen and their colleagues that really looked at kind of what does it mean to be doing survivor-centered work, and is that an effective strategy? And what that work found was that survivors that were working with advocates who used survivor-centered models had less difficulty obtaining community resources over time. They actually experienced less violence over time, and they reported a higher quality of life and higher levels of social support. We actually there's a new systematic review that came out within the last month that has also looked at the same question, and again reinforces this. It also finds that survivors that have advocates that use survivor-centered techniques are more likely to engage with helping professionals in the future. So we just see this really positive interaction when survivors really feel that they're listened to and that their needs are centered as we're trying to figure out what our advocacy looks like. So we are going to take this example to look at how do we do survivor-centered consumer work, and we're going to look at this first from the individual level and then at some of the other levels as well. So we're going to look at it from the survivor. Her name is Jada, and we're going to use this story to kind of make some of these things concrete that we're talking about. So Jada is 23 years old. She's an African-American woman. She lives with her 2-year-old son Jonah and her infant daughter Cameron. She recently moved out of an apartment with her partner James. Throughout the relationship, Jada experienced ongoing emotional, economic, and occasional physical abuse. She's still in contact with James because they have custody that they're working together. But she's very worried about being able to pay her rent on her own, and she hasn't gone through any process to receive child support formally from James, who has a pretty decent job, good job in IT. James gives Jada money every now and then, and sometimes pays for food and clothes for the kids. 2 years ago, Jada was convicted of check writing fraud, and the fraud was a result of her partner's abuse and her feeling like she had to write this check. But she's currently paying restitution on the check writing charge. And she now has several accounts that are in collections. In addition, Jada works as a part-time dietary aide. She has a spotty employment history due to missed work from abuse and also from just caring for young children. She'd really like to get more hours, but she has challenges with her hours are available. And her mother-in-law actually babysits, and sometimes she's not available to take on extra time babysitting the kids. And Jada is really struggling to find affordable childcare that isn't with her mother-in-law. She worries about the kids' safety and how long the mother-in-law will continue to provide childcare. Also recently, James has come up to work a few times to check in on her, to kind of have some arguments. And her boss is frustrated with James interrupting the workplace and raising his voice in front of the residents. So that is the current issue with what's going on with Jada. So what we're going to think about as we look at this is, what would it take to do survivor-centered advocacy with a survivor like Jada? And recognizing that part of the steps of doing survivor-centered advocacy is really doing this full and open assessment of the current financial situation. So again, understanding how the survivor is seeing their financial situation, and also understanding what their strengths are, what they've tried in the past. We're also, as we're working with survivor-centered consumer advocacy, we're reviewing past plans, as I talked about earlier, but also developing current and future economic plans with survivors. We're attending to the economic situation in the face of safety. So this, to me, is what makes us as advocates and lawyers specifically perfectly positioned to do work around consumer issues, because we have the ability to really put that safety lens on all the work that we're doing. So if a survivor is just meeting with a general kind of an economic counselor or somebody like that, they may suggest something that actually may put the survivor at greater risk of harm from what their partner, what may happen with their partner. We also have to understand that the work is a partnership and requires flexibility and a willingness to suspend judgment. So kind of understanding that sometimes survivors are going to make economic choices that, for us, because maybe our value system or our own situation, that we are concerned about or wish that the survivor would make a different choice. But understanding that as we're working with folks, that may be something that they need to do for at that time. So what we're going to ask you to do is kind of look a little bit more at Jada's story, and then kind of think about what might be some work that you would do with her. So you're planning to sit down and meet with Jada. You've met with her once before, and you're going to meet with her again. And she tells you that she has now been issued court papers which name her a defendant in a debt collection lawsuit. And she's really worried because she doesn't have the money to pay both the debtor in the debt collection lawsuit and her rent. She also recently just received a verbal warning at work from James because he came again to the nursing home, refused to leave until Jada would talk to him. She's also frustrated because she just found out that James filed his taxes first and put the kids as a dependent on his return. And also Jada is saying too that she wants to have a bank account for direct deposit of her paycheck for safety, but she hasn't been able to get an account. She went to the bank and she wasn't able to get it. She couldn't understand why or what was going on with why she couldn't get a bank. So we'd love to take a moment for you to think about, if you were going to sit down and meet with Jada for the second time, what would be some of the things that you'd want to know and understand about Jada's safety? What about her financial situation would you want to understand? And what would you want to know or ask about some of Jada's strengths? So we'd love to hear you engage in some of the thinking about how would you want to work with Jada in the chat, if you are able to do that. It looks like there's also been some chat some additional resources provided on the chat as well. Oh, so Elizabeth is asking kind of what are Jada's priorities? What are some of her needs? What does she want? What is she concerned most about? Great. one of the tools that CSAJ has developed is an assessment tool that will be highlighted at the end as well, that has some really great questions when we're trying to figure out what are the survivors' priorities around economics. Jessica is asking, are they married? So kind of wanting to understand what the situation is. Is there any spousal support that's happening in the situation? So Carla was asking expunction of conviction if possible. Thinking about the disputing collections account. So trying to understand. So this looks like we're moving more into actions, kind of thinking about what would we do about it. But maybe what we want to do first is understand, tell me more about this conviction, what's happening with the process, tell me more about, help me understand kind of what you're seeing with your collections accounts and what's going on for them. So great. So Stephanie's asking, what support system does she have available? What are some of the strengths? What are some of the resources we can pull on as we're working on her economic plan and looking at? Great. So Julie asked about, is there any HR at work that could protect Jada, or any supports at work that might be helpful? Some of the other questions that I was thinking about is just one of my favorite questions I like to ask survivors is when they're going to bed at night, what are the concerns that keep them up at night? What are the things that really worry them? What I find is oftentimes the things that I think that would be the biggest concerns for survivors are not. And so I'm prioritizing risks in my own mind that look really different than how the survivor's prioritizing risks. And if I'm starting on my list, then I'm really not matching what the survivor needs. What I've also found in that case when I do that is that survivors will go along with me because of the power imbalance that we have inherently as being somebody that's helping with somebody. So they'll just go along and say, yes, yes. And until I kind of ask, is this my agenda or yours? And they'll be like, well, and then we can kind of talk through that. But thinking about if we're starting with what the survivor wants and needs, that is a great way to get the picture. Other questions we might be asking is, tell me more about your financial situation. What do you do well when it comes to money? What do you hope to get out of our time together after we're done working together? Another question I ask all the time is, as we're talking about strategies, how do you think your partner will react? And what are some of the ways that we can reduce some of the reaction to that? So our next question is kind of looking at, some of you are already jumping into this, which is what I found with lawyers and advocates. It's often hard to stop at the assessment phase, and it's really, we're tempted to go on to, okay, what's next? What's the action phase? So thinking about remembering to stay in that phase of trying to figure out what the situation is, what the survivor wants, what the survivor needs, what are some of the risks that they see, so that we can, instead, before jumping into kind of what are some of the things we can do to assist, thinking about how are we going to plan this work together in partnership. So thinking about what we could do to assist, what information does Jada need, what tools could you provide, who else could help? Somebody was talking about kind of the labor code in California, that so it may be helpful to inform Jada about some of her rights, her employment rights that are coming up. Jessica was also asking, do we want to talk to her about an order of protection from James? Is that something that she's interested in? Would that provide temporary child support? And how could that be a helpful strategy if that's something that she's interested in? Any other things that come to mind, tools that you could provide, information that may be helpful as we're planning with Jada and some of the work that we'd be doing with them? Oh, so I see.
Someone else mentioned access to childcare expenses that may be accessible through the state or through local programs. Someone else talked about civil protection orders. Yeah.
Great. I see somebody also talking about scholarships or loans that could increase credit score. So some interesting ideas kind of around the credit work as well. Mm-hmm. So I hope you're continuing to think about it, but I'm going to share with you kind of some of my thoughts about what we could do with Jada, and also relate some of them to the guidebook that we've been talking about today. So one of the things that we might want to do with Jada is just order a credit report. We're not sure when she's had one last, or if that's something that she's wanting to look at, or that would be helpful. So one of the things we could do is offer that and talk about that. But thinking about credit reports, also kind of wanting to understand if James is looking at her credit report, if he has in the past, if he has her social security number. It sounds like James already knows where she's living and where she's working. So there probably isn't any information that would be updated by ordering her credit report that James doesn't know, but that might be something we'd be engaging with Jada. You know, how would it impact your credit report to if you pulled it now, and that would update kind of the information where you were living at that time. So some of the things we might be doing as we're ordering a credit report is also thinking about the fact that for many survivors, actually for many of us, there are a lot of feelings attached to credit reports. And for a lot of survivors who are dealing with issues of course debt, there also may be trauma attached to some of those things that maybe they didn't know that was on their credit report. So in addition to pulling a credit report, may also be talking with the survivor before looking at it, that these are some things that I've experienced with other people. You know, what are some of the things that you can do to take care of yourself as we're reviewing this credit report? We also might be just doing some basic education about reading a credit report. What is the difference between a score and a report? And kind of having some of that information. Might be talking about how we might want to dispute something. So if there's incorrect information on credit report, that there may be some things that we're wanting to dispute about that. There also might be some things that come up around collections accounts. So we're trying to understand how long those collection accounts have been around, who's doing the collecting, kind of if we're looking at her debt lawsuit, that we're trying to understand where some of that is coming from as well. Some of the other things we might be doing with Jada is also discussing credit building strategies. If that is something that she is wanting to work on, is building up her credit, what does that look like, and how does that look like with the rest of her credit plan? So if you look at, as we talked about earlier with the guidebook, we do have 3 chapters that would be really helpful for Jada in this issues of credits, which would be the credit reporting and repair for survivors, chapter 2, chapter 3, the credit discrimination and predatory lending, and chapter 4 around debt defense, and safety considerations for survivors. So as we're working with Jada, we might be creating a very specific credit action plan as well. That would be talking about what do we want to tackle first, what are some of the things that may help her credit score as we're working on them first, and then what are her longer term plans in terms of credit and what she wants. We also might be talking to Jada about credit safety. What are some of the options that she might have to increase her safety with her current credit? So talking about the option of doing a credit freeze, in which that you can put a pin on your credit report so that nobody can access your credit without giving prior permission. So that is something to talk about with survivors and the pros and cons. The challenge with credit freezes in many states, they do cost money to put them on and off. Some states they are free, but it is a way to protect folks against people using their credit. Might also just talk about if James has been used to kind of using her credit and without her permission, and all of a sudden there's a freeze on it, how may that impact her safety, and what would she tell James if that happened, and kind of talking about how what are some of the situations. So I've had survivors that have said, you know, I've had somebody else is trying to use my credit, and I don't know what's going on. So for safety, I'm going to put a credit freeze on, and kind of not saying that it was you, but having another story about why the credit freeze. Another thing we might want to be doing with Jada is just doing some education on the rights and responsibilities for the debt collection lawsuit. A lot of folks that I have worked with over the years have received information about a debt collection lawsuit, and have not had access to attorneys, or have been very concerned about what that looks like, and then instead of kind of and then just have not gone to court, and as a result, the consumer the company ends up getting a default judgment. So kind of looking at what are some of the things that she could do, and are there connections to resources that we can make with consumer lawyers as well, which some of you on the call may be those exact people. So those are some strategies. The other things we might be wanting to do with Jada also might be related to some of the information in the guidebook. We might be looking at tax options for Jada. We talked about in the story that James has now filed first and used the children on his tax. So looking at chapter 9 of the guidebook may be a helpful strategy. We also might be talking about creating a cost of living plan with Jada. So really that's just a fancy word for a budget, kind of looking at what are Jada's needs, what is she able to cover, what would that look like, how could she increase what's coming in, what would that look like, and how could she decrease some of that. And of course, along with that, we'd always be talking about the safety issues that would be connected to those concerns. We'd also be talking about Jada's financial strengths and how those could be integrated into her her cost of living plan. Some of you also already mentioned kind of discussing the safety options, and that an order of protection may be a possibility in terms of maybe also giving her more protection at work, but also as a possibility in terms of getting child support or maintenance, depending on what are the laws in your area. We also might be talking about understanding getting Jada banked. So she said that she wants to get a bank, but she doesn't know why. So she may be in check systems. We're not sure what's going on for her. So kind of trying to understand what are some of the resources in your community that may have an opportunity to get out of check systems. Or for example, in our community, I'm in St. Louis, we have something called Get Checking, which is a class that you can pay $20 for, and you go through the class, and after you're done with the class, that they're willing to forgive some of the outstanding fees to be able to get banked. So looking at credit unions and what are some of the options in that. And then Jada, if she's talking about payday lending, we might be wanting to talk about the pros and cons of payday lending. Most of us kind of hear about payday lending and we just automatically think, oh, that's awful, and we should, but we want to be really conscious when we're talking to survivors about what are the negatives, and obviously helping survivors really understand the incredible amounts of fees with payday lending, but also understanding that for some of our survivors who don't have access to banks, that it may be a strategy that they may employ, and kind of what that would look like and how that would impact their debt and action plan. So those are just some of the ideas about some of the things that we could do with Jada. And if anybody has other ones that you want to still continue to add on our chat, that would be great. And just thinking that all of these strategies are things that you can find more information about within the guidebook that have some specific tips on these areas and a lot of content on the work that you could do within that area. So when we talked about survivor-centered economic advocacy, what I was just talking about with Jada is mostly individual work. So doing this work that directly with survivors, and understanding that this is a beautiful picture, kind of looking at the challenges that may come up with doing individual advocacy work. But also some of the benefits of doing that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because we did talk just about individual survivor-centered advocacy approaches. There is a piece from CSAJ looking at the different levels of advocacy and kind of within doing economic work, and what are some of the challenges and how we can approach it. But looking at we talked about individual, now looking at organizational survivor-centered economic advocacy is really the work that your organization and everyone within it does to support survivors' economic security and physical safety. So it might be looking at kind of how organizationally are we doing work that really allows survivors to get their needs met around economics, and looking at how maybe some of the structures of our organization, for example, the hours that we operate, what some of the rules are that may prevent survivors from being as successful as they possibly can economically, and looking at kind of how can we create the changes within our own organization to really fit the needs and concerns of survivors, and looking at kind of how do we do that. Well, advocates within organizations could be doing specific work at staff meetings or talking to supervisors about protocols or different things within our organization that may make our work more responsive to the needs of survivors, especially when we're looking at survivors who have marginalized identities, and how sometimes our policies really make it difficult for survivors to get what they need out of the work that we're doing. And then looking at, the systems level of survivor-centered advocacy. And this is, Erica mentioned a little bit earlier, and we saw that nice graphic of the different nestled advocacy strategies. And looking at system-centered survivor advocacy is really looking at federal, state, and local laws, policies, cultural norms, all of these contexts that make survivors less safe because due to our economic systems and strategies, and thinking about how can we work within systems and outside of systems to create change in policies and regulations, in cultural and different ideas that may increase survivors' safety as they're in a larger context. and looking at some of those strategies that we can use to do that work within that.
One thing that some of the, this might provide us with a nice opportunity for some exchange here, because I know that some of the strategies in the box about strategies and practice, the areas of focus include tax, housing, childcare, debt and credit, employment, criminal record barriers, banking, financial services, utilities, medical, and transportation. We can certainly talk about some areas where CSAJ has been involved, both at the state and the federal level, around systems change and policy change to meet the economic needs of survivors. I'm wondering also if folks in our audience today have some examples of policy and systems change work that you either have or currently are involved with to address some of these particular economic challenges facing survivors. So if you would share some of those, I'm sure that your peers would appreciate it. CSAJ, in partnership with, well, Katie was involved in this, as well as many of you who are on this call. We really had the honor of being involved in an effort, two different efforts. One that was related to payday lending. Katie was just talking about that. So there were regulations that were focused on payday lending, and with the help of our expert advisors, as well as the input of advocates and organizations across the country, we were able to articulate the particular dangers and risks posed by the payday lending industry and submit those comments to the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That'd be one example. Another example was with the Department of Education that was considering student loan regulations and the particular tax impact on survivors of domestic violence. They were not centering those experiences, unsurprisingly. And so it was really such a great experience, and to be able to share the stories, the narratives of survivors, as well as advocates and programs who were able to really put some light on how how student debt operates in the lives of domestic violence survivors, and what some of the requirements, particularly those that would rely on abusive partners, what dangers that might present. And we were able to have a meaningful impact in that space. So those are two examples.
And I think one of the things that I think is also really cool to think about is kind of, even if you're doing individual level work and you feel like you don't have the capacity or time or energy, or maybe your role just doesn't lend well to doing that work, the gift that you have doing the individual work is you get to see trends, you get to see things that are continuing to happen over time and that are impacting survivors. And by partnering or connecting with advocacy organizations, something that I like to do is just have a grid that I continue to kind of say things that I'm seeing over and over again. And I maybe have a housing partner that's doing housing advocacy and say, hey, in the last month, 10 survivors that I've worked with have had to deal with issues of nuisance laws. And wow, does that help the advocacy efforts really to have some numbers, to have some movement, to understand what's going on in the individual level, which can be really powerful. I know in Missouri, we've been working the last several years on getting some increased protections in terms of employment, and having folks be able to take work off without worrying to have to lose their job around to go to court or to get other needs taken care of around their domestic violence, and have had some really big challenges in terms of getting that changed. However, in the process of doing that advocacy work, I've created new partnerships and relationships with legislators that possibly weren't seeing the connections between economic abuse and poverty and domestic violence. And so sometimes the strategies, even though it seems like it's moving slow and maybe the legislation isn't to the place that you want, sometimes it's about creating those relationships that help legislators see new things things and help craft legislation in the future. So I think this work is incumbent on all of us, and we all have a role that we can play within that, whether or not we're at the State House, or at the, being able to do nationwide work.
And hi, this is Sarah popping back up. Just to piggyback on that, Katie, if that interests people or resonates with you in your role, let us know how all this is sounding to you in the chat. And just to offer another thing that we've done and would be happy to do with you via email or on the phone or through technical assistance is we've worked with some demonstration sites doing a whole bunch of different work, and the ripple effect that Erica presented at the very beginning has been a really powerful tool that can be transformed into really an activity to engage with your community partners, those that you're really friendly with, as well as those that you'd like to engage with, more to really think through together what is the ripple effect. Perhaps it's focused on the role of education or student loans and survivors, because that's an issue, and how can the community and the partnership build a sense of what the long-term impact looks like and really support each other in bringing to the table myself as an advocate, myself as an attorney, myself as a policy person in another advocacy organization. What are we thinking about? How can we put our priorities on the table and support each other in various efforts, and either bring survivor stories to the advocacy table to shift the tone, to provide a new narrative, or to support the work that others are doing to either move legislation or provide partnership opportunities in an individual advocacy sense. So there are ways that all of the things that Katie and Erica have been talking today can really support and amplify the work that you've already been doing and sounds like are interested in diving deeper into in your community. So feel free to let us know how that or anything that you've seen here today sounds to you, and we can make sure to connect with you individually or as a program. That's all.
Great. That's great. And you're also reminding me, Sarah, of the fact that one of the components of our consumer rights project this time around is a consumer rights working group that will be doing exactly what Katie is suggesting, which is sort of drawing on the very rich expertise of lawyers and advocates on the ground in order to identify common barriers and to create recommendations in terms of systems change. So that is in place, and we absolutely would love to get your input, feedback as we move forward with that initiative, that working group initiative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that sounds very similar to what Carla just said about finding a way to participate in systems or policy advocacy work. So we'll make sure to let you all know how to engage. And it also segues with some of the future trainings that we'll be doing to hopefully help make sense of ways that we can do this work at different levels, given our context, restrictions, and possibilities.
Yes.
And hopefully we'll see ways from the guidebook to engage in some of the issue spotting questions that we have for survivors. We'll also engage your brain in kind of how organizationally you're able, or you have capacity to deal with other issues. So kind of looking at individual capacity, and then organizationally, and then what kind of systems works come out of that. And sometimes asking those questions in different and new ways results in new and different information that we weren't getting from survivors before. So I think from there, we're gonna dive into looking at, again, we're talking about that, this work, the Consumer Rights for Domestic and Sexual Violence Survivors Initiative. I'm trying to move it. here we go, initiative is, as Erica talked about at the very beginning, it's funded through the Office of Violence Against Women for the 2018-2019 year. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the project activities that are going to be going on. So Erica and Sarah launched the series about a month and a half ago or so. And this today was our first series looking at the introduction to the guidebook and looking a little bit more at issue spotting. But we are then going to have 5 training toolkits, which will total 10 different webinars that will cover key guidebook topics, including coerced debt and credit. So that's going to be the first one coming up. We're going to be doing one on federal tax advocacy, on foreclosure prevention and defense, on court-related economic barriers, and then finally one on credit and criminal record barriers to employment. So each training toolkit will be 2 2-hour webinars with resources that come out of them. So each will have a part 1 and a part 2. The part 1 of the training toolkit will really center on the consumer and economic civil legal advocacy for survivors. So our goal is to really identify consumer and economic issues and how they manifest differently in underserved survivors. So kind of as we've been talking about today, how to marginalize communities, how to marginalize survivors, how are they impacted differently by this specific issue. So thinking about coerced debt, how may that look differently for survivors in from different communities. Number 2, we're going to really try to model individual survivor-centered consumer advocacy within that first toolkit. And then we will try to engage with unique strategies that are particular to the consumer issue that's facing by the survivors. So that will be the first part of the 2-part series. And as we said, the first one will be coming up in June, looking at debt and credit. So 2 weeks later, about after the first part of the toolkit, we will have a part 2 that's focusing on the same topic, but we'll really be looking at a partnership for systems change. So for example, with credit and of course debt and credit issues, what we're going to do then in part 2 is have a model program or somebody in the nation that's doing innovative work on this topic, whether it's the topics that I mentioned before, debt and credit, federal tax, foreclosure, court-related economic barriers, or credit or criminal record barriers to employment. And those folks will be available to share kind of some of the work that we've done. And then after that information is shared, participants that are a part of the webinar will be able to break into virtual breakout groups that you will be able to self-select to figure out which one you want to work on, that will look at multi-level strategies based on that specific topic. The different virtual breakouts, one will be issue spotting, so looking more closely at, well, how is this issue showing up for survivors in your community? How do you know what survivors are needing from in that issue? What are some of the biggest concerns they have? Are there things you don't know about what's happening for survivors? For example, maybe you've never asked this question of folks you've worked with, or maybe you recognize that there's a big community of folks who you aren't working with, that you don't know how coerced debt is impacting the work, their lives. I know I use this example a lot, that a lot of us don't know, for survivors who are continuing to stay in relationships and that's their plan, we oftentimes don't know how these different topics are impacting them. So if I'm going to stay and I plan to be with my partner, how could I increase my safety in terms of coerced debt, and thinking about, do we know that, and how, if we don't, how could we get some more of that information? So that would be one breakout session, would be the issue spotting. Another would be the partner mapping. So thinking about, okay, maybe I have a feel for what's going on with this issue of coerced debt in my community and for survivors, but who am I partnered with that may be able to help me with this issue, or who am I not partnered with? So thinking about, are there other folks within our community who are doing debt and credit work that could really help me understand this? Or are there lawyers that I'm not connected to? Or are there different types of advocates? Are there anti-poverty groups that are doing this work? Are there immigrant works that are organizations that are doing this work that I'm not connected with? And how could I create partnerships with those? And then the third level, or the third virtual group you could go into, is strategic action planning, thinking about maybe I have my partners and I'm working on this issue, but what changes would we like to make either within our community or within policy or within rules within our community, or then looking at state laws or federal laws. And so each participant can self-select into one of those 3 topics, and we will have worksheets and kind of work guides that will help us all plan that process. So it's kind of a different type of structure than we've seen. I think it's really an exciting opportunity to really take the information that we learn on an individual level to figure out how do I then map this out to create change in our community in different ways. So we're excited for ththose coming up. So we'll be seeing from CSAJ some of that information come up. So hopefully that you will be available and interested in getting more involved in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I just typed into the chat, let us know how this jives with you. Does it sound exciting? Does it sound helpful to what you're thinking and what Katie and Erica have presented today? Are there other things that would also be helpful? We have a lot going on, and of course would love to hear from you all about the best ways to engage you, learn from you, and dig deep with you. So thanks, Jason. This sounds awesome. Anyone else? Does it sound terrible? Does it sound confusing? Let us know.
Great. Well, that leads us to ask you, do you have any final questions and answer? You have questions. Maybe we have answers. Anything else that you'd like to pose, or some more thinking that you'd like to do around the issues of issue spotting, the use of the guidebook, and which might be helpful for you all, and then also looking at survivor-centered advocacy at multiple levels. If you have any questions for us, we are really happy to answer those questions or try.
What we could do, because I know that sometimes when I'm participating in a webinar, it takes me a little while to get my question together. Mm-hmm. So we could delve into some of the resources, and if folks have questions that occur to them along the way, feel free to type them and we will get to them. Does that sound okay?
Great.
I know, Sarah, did you want to talk about the evaluations right now, or do you want to wait until end time?
Yeah, I think since we have time, we can hold it to the end. The resources would be helpful, I think.
Okay, great. So, let's see if I have control of this PowerPoint again. Indeed, I do. Okay, great. So we have a lot of resources. Many of them you can find, if not all of them, you can find on our website. First, I just want to share with you, this is our 2018 Consumer Rights Calendar. And there's some things in here called spotlights, which I'm just about to explain in just a minute. So try and hold your excitement for that one. And then others involve the webinar that Katie just sort of marched through the structure of that, but you'll see when the different webinars are laid out, as well as newsletters, things of that.
And just to interject that we've just finalized the webinar calendar, so you'll be receiving like a full calendar, so you can kind of put it on your calendar, register in advance, and have that handy. So we'll get that out to everyone soon.
Great. Yeah, so if you need to be on our email distribution list to access that as well, or our Facebook account. So make sure that we're connected. Okay. Oh, there we go. Spotlights. So one of the things that we're doing on this project is we are spotlighting innovative consumer and economic justice initiatives. So the purpose is to shine a spotlight on different programs, projects across the country that are doing really exciting, innovative consumer and economic justice work, so that we can share best practices in this area, and folks can think about how it might apply in their own setting. So if you're interested in being a spotlight, we encourage you to complete a form, and the link for that is right here. And I know you'll be getting a copy of this PowerPoint as well. And it's a fairly simple form for you to fill out, and we will follow up with you. We'll be doing short little videos of folks and sharing all of the rich learning. So encourage you to connect with us if that's interesting. Oops. This is our screening tool, our consumer rights screening tool, which many of you may have already seen. It's been around for a while, but I think is still helpful. We have lots of trainings that are available, previous webinar trainings that you can access through our website, as well as resources on all of these topics and more. These are some of the key resources that we have developed over the course of the past several years: a national needs assessment report, which I mentioned before, an article that speaks in greater depth about economic ripple effect, a report on CSAJ's pilot sites that not only describes their work, but also shares some core learnings that came out of that pilot site work, which folks have often found informative when they're trying to think about their own community and organizational context, as well as CSAJ's assessment tool for attorneys and advocates. It helps folks to get a better sense of sort of their readiness, both individually and organizationally, in terms of engaging in economic and consumer rights work. So all four of those are fairly core CSAJ resources. We have a pretty extensive resource library that you can access as well on all sorts of different types of areas of law and advocacy. And then, yeah, I mentioned that we have webinars on an array of different consumer issues. I don't know why this isn't moving. You know about this. This is our guidebook that we've been talking about today. You can access that online. Make sure that when you do that, it is going to ask you for a password. So don't worry, nothing, you're not blocked from it. You just have to make sure that you use the password, and you will be able to get there. This is our atlas on economic security, accounting for survivors' economic security, and atlas for direct service providers. This was created about 1.5 years or so ago, and is the first map book of what will be 3. This one is about mapping the terrain, and it sets forth 4 different guideposts for engaging in economic work that shifts our work from self-sufficiency to economic agency. So it is rich with research and informative in terms of offering some guiding principles. So I encourage you to access it online. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, and then this is our latest resource. We are very excited about this. One of the projects that CSAJ launched in 2015 is our Racial and Economic Equity for Survivors project, otherwise known as REAP. And during the course of that project, we and our powerful partners conducted a number of listening sessions with folks across the country around how racial bias shows up in their work. And this very newly released report called Showing Up: How We See, Speak, and Respond to Racial Inequity Facing Survivors is a report that attempts to dialogue back with the field about those listening sessions. I encourage you to download it and think with us some more about how it relates to your own work and your efforts to address racial and economic inequity in in your communities and in your states. That is it for resources. Sarah, would you like to chime in about evaluations and other important things?
I would love to. So if you do have thoughts or final questions for Erica or Katie, please feel free to continue chatting them. I also encourage you, as you exit the webinar today, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation. And we, Erica can tell you, we do not take those things lightly, and we gather a lot of powerful, rich insights from you, both in terms of how we can support your work and how we can work with you. So please, if questions or thoughts or needs come up while you're taking that, drop us a note in that evaluation, and we'll make sure to follow up with you, and hopefully you'll see some of the impact of the insights you provide us in future trainings, resources, all of those things. So I encourage you to take that, contact us if you want to dive in deeper or have some conversations, and look forward to the announcement with our webinar calendar, so you can join us in our training toolkit series over the next couple of years. Really thrilled, very grateful for you, Katie, and for you, Erica, today, and thanks to everybody who joined. Hope you have sunny spring days ahead of you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.